In 1974, 17-year-old Carla Walker left home with the kind of excitement only a high school dance can create. She never returned. Her disappearance, and the tragedy that followed, sent shockwaves across Fort Worth, leaving a family shattered and a city desperate for answers. For years, detectives chased leads, questioned suspects, and tried to piece together a crime with almost no forensic tools to support them. And as time passed, hope faded. Carla's case became one of Texas's most haunting cold cases. But in 2019, everything changed. Advances in DNA technology, techniques unimaginable in the 70s, gave investigators a second chance. And inside that carefully preserved dress, they uncovered the microscopic evidence that would finally expose the man who had escaped justice for 46 years. And before we continue, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from today? Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about a crime. It's a story about persistence, science, and a truth that refused to stay buried. Before her name became tied to one of Fort Worth's most enduring mysteries, Carla Walker was known simply as Carla, the bright, soft-spoken 17-year-old who lit up every room she walked into. She was the middle child in a close-knit Texas family, the kind of girl who balanced kindness with a quiet confidence. Friends remembered her for her warm smile, her neatly styled hair, and the way she never made anyone feel left out. At Western Hills High School, she was well-liked, active, and always willing to help others. Carla was excited for the future. She talked about college, about growing up, and about the life she imagined for herself. She loved spending time with her siblings, and she was especially close to her mother, often sharing stories from school as they cooked together in the kitchen. Fort Worth in the mid-70s was still a city where neighbors knew each other, where front doors stayed unlocked, and where girls like Carla could dream freely. For the Walkers, it was a safe, predictable world, until the night it wasn't. In February 1974, Carla was preparing for something special, her school's Valentine's dance. Her boyfriend, Rodney, had already picked out a corsage. Her dress was ready. Her family snapped pictures before she headed out, moments frozen in time, capturing innocence on the edge of a tragedy no one could have imagined. Those final snapshots, filled with genuine teenage joy, and would later become treasured memories for a family coping with a devastating loss. It's important to remember that before the case, before the headlines and investigations, there was Carla, a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a young woman with a full life ahead of her. Understanding who she was helps us understand what was truly lost. Valentine's weekend in Fort Worth should have ended like countless others. Teenagers laughing in parking lots, trading stories from the dance, planning where to grab a late-night snack before heading home. For Carla Walker and her boyfriend Rodney, the night began exactly that way. After leaving the school event, they stopped at a nearby bowling alley, a familiar hangout spot for local teens. The energy was light, ordinary, and reassuringly predictable. Sometime after midnight, Carla and Rodney returned to his car, a Dodge Charger parked in the lot. What happened next remains one of the most haunting sequences in this case, a moment that investigators have revisited for decades in hopes of finding clarity. As Rodney later told police, a man suddenly appeared beside the driver's window, an intrusion so abrupt it disrupted the comfort of an otherwise routine night. The stranger didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He simply acted with chilling efficiency. In the seconds that followed, Rodney was struck repeatedly, the blows disorienting him and leaving him barely conscious. The attack was forceful enough to fracture bones, yet carried out with a level of control that suggested the assailant had a plan. Carla, terrified but still alert, was pulled from the car. And witnesses would later note that the area wasn't deserted. Cars had passed nearby that night, yet timing and shadows worked against the couple. The assault was fast, deliberate, and over before anyone could intervene. When Rodney regained enough awareness to look around, Carla was gone. Those minutes, fleeting, chaotic, and violently abrupt, set off a chain of events that would ripple through the Walker family, the Fort Worth community, and Texas law enforcement for nearly half a century. Rodney managed to find help despite his injuries, flagging down assistance from a nearby residence. Police were contacted immediately. By the time officers arrived, the parking lot had transitioned from a teenage social spot to a crime scene marked by confusion, blood evidence, and a missing girl. It was the beginning of one of the most complex and emotionally devastating investigations in the city's history. The search for Carla began before dawn. Officers, volunteers, and neighbors combed through fields, drainage areas, and back roads stretching out from the bowling alley. In 1974, Fort Worth law enforcement relied heavily on manpower and local knowledge, mapping likely routes, interviewing residents, and scanning rural stretches that were often used for dumping stolen property or abandoned vehicles. Late in the afternoon of February 19th, a grim report came in. A railroad worker traveling near Benbrook, several miles from where Carla was taken, noticed something in a concrete drainage culvert. It was a location partially shielded from the road, so it's the kind of spot someone familiar with the area might choose if they wanted to avoid being seen. When officers arrived, their worst fears were confirmed. Carla Walker had been found. Her body showed signs of assault, but investigators were cautious with public statements. They focused on what could be confirmed: the approximate time frame, the condition of the scene, and the physical evidence that indicated she had been left there shortly after her abduction. Detectives immediately secured the site, understanding that any fibers, impressions, or biological materials could be crucial. Carla's family was notified shortly afterward. For them, the world they once knew, the predictable rhythms of school, home, and community life, fractured instantly. Fort Worth residents, too, felt the impact. This was not a distant tragedy. This was local, personal, and deeply unsettling. And for investigators, it was now a race against degradation of evidence. The culvert was exposed to the elements. Water flow, temperature changes, and debris all posed risks to trace materials that might help establish what happened during Carla's final hours. This marked the start of an investigation that would span generations and challenge every investigative tool available at the time. For Fort Worth detectives, the hours immediately following the discovery of Carla's body were crucial. Crime scene teams worked to preserve what they could from the drainage culvert, an environment that made evidence collection difficult. Soil saturation, flowing water, and uneven terrain all threatened the integrity of trace materials. Still, investigators gathered fibers, photographed impressions, and documented the area in hopes that something, even something microscopic, might offer direction. The first major source of information was Rodney, Carla's boyfriend. Speaking through visible injuries, he described the attacker as a white male, possibly in his 20s, with noticeable strength and a calm, controlled demeanor during the assault. Detectives noted the precision of the attack, the rapid force used to incapacitate Rodney, and the purposeful way the assailant seized Carla. This raised an early question. Was this someone who had done something like this before? While that possibility circulated privately among investigators, they were careful not to overstate it publicly. Law enforcement in the 1970s often withheld speculative assessments to avoid contaminating early witness accounts. Police canvassed the bowling alley and surrounding areas, Several teenagers reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles circling the parking lot earlier that night, while others had noticed a man standing near the entrance who didn't seem connected to any group. These leads were logged, but not immediately actionable. Descriptions varied, memories were inconsistent, and lighting conditions had been poor. One opportunity for engagement that investigators used at the time, long before digital recordings and modern databases, was distributing composite sketches based on witness input. This process relied heavily on human memory, which modern forensic psychology now acknowledges can be highly malleable in stressful situations. Despite the limitations, detectives hoped the sketches might jog a local resident's recollection. As the hours turned into days, pressure mounted. Carla's funeral drew community members from across Fort Worth, many of whom feared that whoever had taken her was still nearby. Detectives increased patrols, interviewed known offenders in the area, and checked for similar cases in neighboring jurisdictions. Before we move forward, here's a quick interaction prompt woven naturally into the narrative. Mid-video CTA engagement prompt. As we examine these early investigative steps, I'm curious. How familiar are you with Fort Worth or the surrounding Texas cities? Drop where you're watching from in the comments. It helps us understand how far cases like this reach. The early investigation had direction, but it also had uncertainty. And uncertainty in homicide work can grow quickly. News of Carla Walker's murder spread through Fort Worth faster than any official announcement ever could. Parents who once allowed their children to walk home from school now insisted on picking them up. Porch lights, which had mostly been decorative, became nightly fixtures. And doors, once left unlocked without a second thought, were secured with chains and deadbolts. Carla's case wasn't just a tragedy. It was a disruption of the silent agreement that held small communities together. The belief that safety was normal and danger was distant. Within a week, the atmosphere changed so drastically that longtime residents remarked it felt like the town had aged 10 years overnight. Teenagers, who had once gathered in groups outside the bowling alley, began staying home. Couples who used to park along Benbrook Lake stopped going entirely. Even church leaders addressed the topic from the pulpit, urging calm while acknowledging the fear that had overtaken the community. Rumors took on a life of their own. Some insisted the killer was a traveling criminal who had already left Texas. Others believed it was someone local, someone who had simply blended back into the crowd after committing the crime. With so many people shaken, speculation spread faster than facts ever could. This fear deeply affected the Walker family. Inside their home, the grief was overwhelming. Carla's mother, Doris, became withdrawn, often sitting in her daughter's room late into the night. Her father, Leighton, responded in a different way, by going out. He drove the roads near Benbrook Lake every evening, scanning the ditches, the tree lines, the empty lots, trying to retrace what might have happened. And he fought sleep, believing answers always lived just one more mile down the road. Carla's younger brother, Jim, absorbed everything. The quiet conversations, the long drives, the endless search. At just 12 years old, he felt the weight of the community's fear in a deeply personal way. His sister's name was whispered in hallways, mentioned at school assemblies, and discussed by adults who thought children weren't listening. Jim didn't need reminders. He lived the loss every day. As tension grew, one truth became clear. The killer had not been caught. And until he was, no one felt truly safe. That fear set the stage for a decades-long obsession with finding the man responsible. As the investigation unfolded, detectives faced a difficult reality familiar in many violent crime cases. Statistically, the last person seen with the victim is often the first person questioned. And in Carla Walker's case, that person was her boyfriend, 17-year-old Rodney McCoy. Initially, Rodney was regarded as a victim. He had suffered a brutal head injury. His face was still swollen and stitched, and his story never wavered. But pressure to find answers and the lack of clear leads soon shifted the community's attention toward him in a way that was both unfair and devastating. Rumors began quietly. A classmate suggested Rodney might have been jealous. Someone else whispered that his story seemed too dramatic. Within weeks, these speculations had spread through Western Hills High School and into the surrounding neighborhoods. People who had once admired Rodney as the school's senior quarterback now avoided him in public places. The police, so for their part, were caught in a delicate position. They had to consider every possibility. They interviewed Rodney multiple times. They checked his alibi, re-evaluated his medical records, and even questioned whether the injuries on his head were consistent with his version of events. But each path led nowhere. Every detail matched. His injuries were severe, not staged. And nothing in his history, behavior, temperament, or relationships suggested he was capable of harming Carla. Still, the suspicion lingered because the case had stalled. When police used hypnosis in an attempt to help Rodney recall clearer details, the emotional toll on him became even more visible. Each session forced him to relive the attack, seeing Carla being pulled out of the car, hearing her scream for her father, and feeling the helplessness of being beaten unconscious. Witnesses described Rodney sobbing afterward, barely able to speak. Inside the Walker household, Rodney found refuge. Carla's parents never doubted him. They let him stay in her room for days after the funeral, understanding his grief was as genuine as their own. To them, he was not a suspect. He was another victim of the man who had taken their daughter. But grief-stricken families do not control public opinion. And as the gossip intensified, Rodney felt the walls closing in. Eventually, after graduation, the pressure became so unbearable that he made a decision no teenager should ever have to make. He left Texas, leaving behind his home, his friends, and the girl he loved. With Rodney effectively ruled out, investigators widened their scope. The pressure from the community was immense. Residents wanted answers, and detectives were determined to provide them. But in the absence of modern forensic science, they relied heavily on interviews, intuition, and physical evidence that offered more questions than conclusions. In the first several weeks, police interviewed dozens of individuals connected to the bowling alley, including staff members, frequent patrons, and teenagers who had been at the Valentine's dance with Carla and Rodney. Some remembered unfamiliar men lingering around the parking lot. Others recalled hearing a vehicle speeding away around the time of the abduction. But these accounts were inconsistent. Different car colors, different clothing descriptions, different timelines. Detectives also examined Carla's personal relationships. They interviewed former boyfriends, acquaintances from school, and young men who might have held grudges or romantic interests. None of these interviews produced anything substantial. Carla was well-liked, with no known conflicts that pointed to violence. Then came the more concerning possibilities. Local troublemakers, drifters known to pass through Fort Worth, carnival workers who traveled seasonally. At the time, these transient groups were often scrutinized due to their mobility and lack of strong community ties. Police interrogated several men who matched general descriptions, but again, no evidence connected them to Carla's abduction. One name that surfaced early was Glenn Samuel McCurley, a 31-year-old Fort Worth truck driver. His connection to the case was startlingly specific. He owned a Ruger .22 caliber handgun, the same type associated with the magazine clip found near Rodney's car. When detectives questioned him, McCurley claimed the gun had been stolen. He also passed a polygraph test, which held significant weight in 1974 despite its known flaws today. With no physical evidence tying him to the crime and a seemingly convincing explanation, McCurley was crossed off the suspect list. This decision would haunt the investigation for decades. Other leads followed similar patterns, promising at first, then dissolving under scrutiny. One man falsely confessed to killing Carla, but investigators quickly realized his details were fabricated. Another suspect lived near the area where her body was found, but nothing linked him directly. And by the end of the first year, the case had collected more paperwork than answers. The trail was cooling quickly, and a harsh truth began to settle in. Carla Walker's killer had slipped through the cracks. As the months turned into years, Carla Walker's case slipped from the headlines, but never from the lives of those who loved her, or from a community still shaken by the brutality of her death. Fort Worth evolved, new neighborhoods formed, and businesses rose where empty lots once stood. But the shadow of 1974 remained. Inside the Walker home, grief matured into something quieter, but heavier. Leighton Walker, Carla's father, refused to let the case fade into memory. He began keeping a small metal box packed with handwritten notes, names of men he found suspicious, addresses of people who lived near the bowling alley, odd comments he overheard, anything that might someday matter. It became an obsession, one he carried through the years like a private investigative archive. Doris Walker grieved differently. She spent long hours in Carla's room, preserving it exactly as it had been. Her daughter's belongings, clothes, yearbooks, letters, remained untouched, becoming a shrine to the life stolen from her. Friends said Doris spoke less and aged more quickly than a woman her age should have. For Carla's little brother Jim, the tragedy shaped his entire identity. At just 12 years old, he had watched the world of childhood innocence collapse around him. While other kids were riding bikes and playing football, Jim found himself wandering the area near Lake Benbrook, trying to understand the place where his sister's body had been found. He believed that if he could just feel what she felt, he might somehow understand who had done this to her. As he grew older, this need for answers didn't fade. It sharpened. Jim studied criminal psychology, learned investigative techniques, and eventually entered police training with a single goal: to join law enforcement and gain access to his sister's file. But his dream shattered when he failed a vision test. A congenital condition meant he would gradually lose his eyesight. He had no choice but to leave the academy. Even without a badge, Jim never stopped searching. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, a disturbing pattern emerged in Fort Worth. Young women disappearing or found murdered in ways that bore troubling similarities to Carla's case. Strangulations, isolated dump sites, victims placed in culverts. Detectives quietly wondered whether a single predator had hunted their city for years. But without forensic tools like DNA analysis, these theories were nearly impossible to confirm. By the 1990s, Carla Walker's case had become a haunting piece of Fort Worth lore. Officers who joined the department knew her name before ever reading the file. Her case was a symbol of failure, of fear, and of the fragility of safety. Still, despite decades of searching, one question remained unanswered. Who killed Carla Walker? And the answer, buried deep in evidence stored away for nearly 50 years, had been waiting all along. By 2019, Carla Walker's case had become one of the oldest and most painful cold cases in Fort Worth's history. For nearly 5 decades, investigators had rotated through the file, reading, reviewing, hoping for a spark that never came. But everything changed the day Detective Leah Wagner picked up the case. Wagner, a seasoned investigator and a mother herself, felt an immediate pull toward Carla's story. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime, it was the grief left behind, the lingering injustice, and the fact that Carla's family had lived their entire lives without answers. She partnered with fellow detective Jeff Bennett, and together they made a decision that would forever shift the trajectory of the case. They would re-examine the evidence using modern forensic science. Inside the aging evidence boxes, they found Carla's powder blue dress, carefully preserved in a paper bag. That single decision by investigators in 1974, using breathable paper instead of plastic, may have been the reason any DNA survived at all. Wagner immediately contacted forensic experts, including renowned cold case investigator Paul Holes, who played a major role in solving the Golden State Killer case. If anyone understood what was possible with degraded, decades-old DNA, it was Holes. He arranged for Carla's clothing to be sent to a specialized laboratory capable of handling extremely small, fragile samples. The risk was enormous. The DNA remaining on her dress and bra strap was so minimal that one wrong move could destroy it forever. For Jim Walker, who had spent decades clinging to hope, waiting for updates during this process was agonizing. Weeks passed without news. Then, finally, a call came. Lab technicians had found something, a tiny trace of male DNA on Carla's bra strap, along with another faint sample on her dress. It wasn't enough to generate a full profile for CODIS, the National DNA Database, but it was enough to try something revolutionary: forensic genetic genealogy. This method, the same one used to catch the Golden State Killer, doesn't rely on perfect DNA matches. Instead, it compares DNA to public genealogy databases to identify relatives of potential suspects, building a family tree backwards to uncover the source. Wagner and Bennett sent the samples to Othram, a cutting-edge forensic genealogy lab in Texas. CEO David Mittleman and his team began the painstaking process of amplifying what little DNA they had, each molecule treated like a priceless artifact. When the results finally came in, they revealed something shocking. The genetic markers pointed to a single family line in Fort Worth, a family that had lived in the area at the time of the murder, and a family connected to a man investigators had spoken to decades earlier, a man who had slipped through their fingers in 1974. Glenn Samuel McCurley. After nearly 50 years, the truth was finally rising to the surface. When the genealogical data pointed toward the McCurley family line, detectives Wagner and Bennett felt a mix of disbelief and grim recognition. The name wasn't new. In fact, it had lived quietly in Carla's file since the earliest days of the investigation, just one line in an interview log, quickly dismissed after a past polygraph, and a claim that his gun had been stolen. Now, nearly half a century later, Glenn Samuel McCurley was no longer a footnote. He was the focal point. The detectives began digging into his history. McCurley had lived in Fort Worth his entire life, and he worked as a truck driver in the 1970s, lived near Carla's high school, and had a routine that blended him seamlessly into the community. He married, raised children, attended church, and never drew attention to himself. From the outside, he looked like every other middle-aged family man who waved to neighbors and coached Little League. But the DNA didn't lie. Wagner and Bennett approached their next steps carefully. Forensic genealogy identifies a family line, but it doesn't confer guilt. They needed physical confirmation. They needed Glenn McCurley's DNA. So they began surveillance. McCurley, now in his 70s, still lived in Fort Worth. They watched him run errands, sit on his porch, throw away his trash. Casual, ordinary moments that now carried enormous weight. After several days, they retrieved an item he had discarded. The Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab tested it and compared the sample to the DNA recovered from Carla's clothing. This time, the match was direct. Not a relative, not a distant branch of the family tree. Him the detectives prepared for a careful, methodical interview. Not to pressure, not to coerce, but to document his statements before any confrontation with the DNA evidence. When they arrived at McCurley's home, he answered the door politely. He looked older, quieter, but his demeanor was calm. They spoke in his living room first. He claimed he barely remembered 1974. He denied ever seeing Carla. He repeated the same explanation he'd given decades earlier, that his Ruger pistol had been stolen long before the murder. His answers were vague, his memory inconsistent. Then the detectives shifted the conversation. They told him they had his DNA. They told him it had been found on Carla's clothing. They gave him time to absorb the words. McCurley's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. A cracking in the mask he'd worn for decades. A long silence filled the room. When he finally spoke, his story began to unravel. Suddenly, he could remember details he had previously forgotten. Details no innocent person could have known. Detectives Wagner and Bennett knew the moment had arrived. After hours of circling the truth, Glenn McCurley sat hunched forward at the interview table, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. His earlier calm had evaporated. The weight of the DNA evidence, undeniable, scientific, inescapable, pressed on him from every angle. For a long stretch, he said nothing. Then, in a low, uneven voice, he murmured, I guess I need to tell y'all what happened." The detectives remained silent, giving him room to speak. McCurley exhaled deeply. He claimed he had been drinking that night back in 1974. He said he was driving around Fort Worth aimlessly, trying to clear his head. That was when he allegedly spotted Carla and Rodney's car parked by the river. In his version, it was all impulsive. No plan, no reason beyond what he called a stupid mistake. But the more he talked, the clearer it became that this wasn't an accident. This was predatory. He admitted approaching the car. He admitted taking Carla. He admitted the violence that followed. And then he said something that chilled the detectives to the bone. He claimed he didn't plan on killing her, but things got out of control. This wasn't a moment of regret. It was a practiced rationalization, polished over 46 years. At times, McCurley tried to minimize his actions. At others, he blamed his drinking. But every detail he gave aligned with the evidence investigators had preserved for decades. The location, the condition of Carla's belongings, even the specific area where her body was found. Only the killer could have known those things. When the detectives asked why he never came forward, why he let Carla's parents, especially her father Jim, suffer for nearly half a century, McCurley lowered his head and whispered, "I didn't think anyone would ever find out." It was a naked, unfiltered truth. Not remorse, not sorrow, just fear, finally catching up to him. By the time the interview ended, the detectives had everything they needed: a full confession, DNA confirmation, and a suspect who had run out of lies to hide behind. As they placed McCurley under arrest, but the decades-long shadow over Carla Walker's case began to lift. After his confession, the arrest of 77-year-old Glenn Samuel McCurley sent shockwaves through Fort Worth. Neighbors who had known him for decades were stunned. He wasn't the type of man anyone would have suspected. Not the quiet husband, not the man who mowed his lawn every Saturday, not the grandfather who waved to kids on bicycles. But beneath that ordinary exterior lived a secret he had buried for almost half a century. Now, it was finally exposed. The Tarrant County District Attorney's Office moved quickly. McCurley was formally charged with capital murder, and prosecutors prepared for a case that blended modern forensic science with evidence collected in the 1970s, evidence once thought too degraded to ever be useful again. As news of the arrest spread, the Carla Walker's family braced for what they had long believed might never come, a courtroom reckoning. Her siblings, now adults with families of their own, were suddenly thrust back into the darkest moment of their lives. And her father, Jim, who had spent decades searching for justice, would finally see the man accused of taking his daughter's life held accountable. The pre-trial hearings drew heavy attention. Reporters filled the hallways. True crime fans and local residents watched closely, stunned that a 46-year-old cold case was suddenly very much alive. McCurley initially entered a plea of not guilty, a move that infuriated many who knew the overwhelming evidence stacked against him. His defense attorney argued age, health, memory lapses, and attempted to question the validity of genealogical DNA tracing. But the prosecution was relentless. They had the confession, they had the DNA, and they were prepared to lay out, step by step, how science had resurrected a case once thought impossible to solve. As the trial date approached, pressure on McCurley increased. Prosecutors made it clear they were ready to pursue the case to its fullest extent. Witnesses from the original investigation were prepared to testify. Crime lab experts were scheduled, and, most significantly, Carla's family stood ready to face him in court. But before the trial could begin, before the jury was selected, before opening statements, before the testimony that would have painted the full, brutal picture, Glenn McCurley made a drastic decision. He changed his plea. In a quiet, tense courtroom, with Carla's family watching from the front row, McCurley rose to his feet and told the judge he would plead guilty to the kidnapping and murder of Carla Walker. After 46 years of silence, denial, and hidden truth, justice had finally stepped into the light. Carla Walker's case stands as one of the most powerful examples of what determination, evolving science, and unwavering love can accomplish. For nearly half a century, her family lived in the shadow of unanswered questions, clinging to memories while fearing the world had forgotten her. But Carla was never forgotten, not by her loved ones, not by the community, and not by the investigators who refused to let her story fade. The breakthrough in her case reshaped how law enforcement approaches cold cases nationwide. It proved that forensic genealogy isn't just a scientific tool. It's a bridge connecting past and present, capable of giving voices back to victims who were silenced long ago. Carla's case demonstrated that even when decades pass, the truth leaves traces behind. For Carla's father, Jim, justice came just in time. Before he passed away, he finally saw the man responsible for his daughter's murder brought to justice, an emotional victory he had dreamed of for nearly his entire life. His persistence became a symbol of a parent's love that refused to surrender. And for the thousands who followed this case, Carla's story became a reminder that time doesn't erase truth. It only waits for the moment it can be revealed. Carla Walker's legacy is more than a solved case. It's a testament to hope, to resilience, and to the idea that justice, no matter how delayed, still matters.